During the 20th century, barbed wire became the symbol of war, death, destruction, and human suffering. We all know the imagery from the First World War, the no man's land littered with barbed wire and bodies hanging in it. But it didn't just remain in the First World War. After all, barbed wire is insanely effective and cost efficient. During the Second World War, it was eagerly used for concentration camps, and after the war, the Iron Curtain and the primitive version of the Berlin Wall consisted of barbed wire. And it is still used to protect borders and imprison dangers to society, even today. But the invention of this symbol of war wasn't out of any military necessities. During the late 19th century, a businessman and cattle rancher from the United States wanted to keep his cattle in a certain area, and he did some experimenting. Little did he know, his invention would not just change his personal fortune, but the history of the United States and the entire world. Right, so barbed wire was invented in 1874 by the American businessman and sheriff Joseph Farwell Glidden. It is a type of barbed wire we still know today, robust, sturdy, and cost-efficient. Glidden initially invented it as a way to enclose cattle on the large American ranches and to mark private property. Before we get to Glidden's version of barbed wire we know today, I want to take a quick look at its earlier versions, because in 1860, Léon Baladin, a French inventor, received a patent for his version of barbed wire. He created a form that was used to protect trees against wildlife and animals. It is said this version did what it meant to do, but was challenging to produce and use on a large scale. Farmers and ranchers didn't necessarily see use for it yet. 7 years later, Lucien B. Smith managed to attain a patent on his version of the barbed wire, although that too didn't see any mass production or use. Now, as for Joseph Glidden, his success was in part thanks to the favorable circumstances. In the little American town of DeKalb in Illinois, he had purchased 243 hectares of ground where he wanted to establish a cattle ranch. It was challenging to keep the cattle in the enclosed area. They would break out and start grazing in the vegetable garden his wife tended to. After some brainstorming, Joseph thought of a solution. He bought multiple rolls of iron wire. He then used a coffee grinder to create barbs, attached them to the iron wire, and used a second wire to keep the barbs in place. The final product was very effective. It kept the cattle in check, and at the same time was a great way to mark his lands. He patented barbed wire in 1874, but before long questions arose about its originality. Glidden ended up involved in legal disputes which took years to settle because there had been previous types of barbed wire, as we have seen. Eventually, he won the case and established the Barbed Fence Company in DeKalb, quickly earning him enough to become a wealthy and affluent businessman. Now, Glidden's invention was simple, yet incredibly effective. News rapidly spread, and in the region, dozens of barbed wire factories sprung up. These factories obviously did not have the patent, and as such, the illegal production of barbed wire increased rapidly. Its popularity did as well, and as news about this efficient method to keep cattle enclosed spread throughout the United States, everyone wanted a piece. The wire, at first glance, didn't seem sturdy like a wooden fence did, so imagine the surprise when a steep and seemingly weak wire managed to stop cattle from breaking out. The surprise only added to the enthusiasm surrounding the product. To give you an idea, in 1884, the newspaper, The Prairie Farmer, published a special edition to the phenomenon that in industrialized history has met no equal. And the sales numbers back that up. In 1882, the same newspaper published some statistics about barbed wire. That year, 82 million kilos were sold, an 18,000-fold increase since 1874. Joseph Glidden managed to become a millionaire, a rare feat at the time. Throughout the years, he became, besides a businessman, the sheriff of the town, member of the board of supervisors of DeKalb County, and member of the executive committee of agriculture. In 1876, he even was the candidate for the Democratic Party for the US Senate elections. At the time of Glidden's death in 1906, he was among the richest men of the United States, having a net worth of around $1 million, including the Glidden House Hotel, the DeKalb Rolling Mill, a factory, the DeKalb Chronicle newspaper, and farming grounds in Illinois and Texas. The little town Glidden in Iowa is even named after him. The invention of barbed wire did influence the history of the United States significantly, and world history as well. As for the United States, it led to the rapid progression of the final stage of colonization and the trek westward. Barbed wire made it incredibly easy to enclose private territory, which led to an end to the real Wild West. The volume of confrontations between farmers and cattle ranchers did increase. Farmers that marked their territory with barbed wire, in effect closing it off to third parties, and made it impossible for other cattle to graze on. There even is a Lucky Luke story about this development, barbed wire on the prairie. In effect, the cowboys and cattle ranchers had to start sharing the Wild West with farmers. Because of the ability to fence off property, the gap between landless and land-owning classes became more apparent than it already had been. Now, barbed wire also had a use to close off borders. One of the notorious examples is the Dodendraad, the wire of death, a lethal electric fence put up by the German military to control the Dutch-Belgian frontier during the First World War. These fences were put up to prevent smuggling and military desertions. The wire of death on the border caused dozens of deaths between 1915 and 18, often killing smugglers, but occasionally unaware citizens as well. We're all too familiar with the examples I named earlier, concentration camps or the early stages of the Berlin Wall, for example. All in all, barbed wire was invented in order to manage cattle instead of, close off borders, concentration camps, or the no man's land during the First World War. But nevertheless, it remained even today because of its cost efficiency and effectiveness. Thank you for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons. If you haven't already, consider checking me out on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.